Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined by a Connecticut author whose star has been steadily on the rise, Wendy Walker. Now known for her dark psychological thrillers, Wendy began her writing career in women's fiction with the titles Four Wives and Social Lives. She also edited multiple entries in the Chicken Soup for the Soul canon. Prior to that, Wendy had careers as a financial analyst and corporate attorney, and later practiced family law, a vocation that exposed her to the complicated dynamics that often make or break familial relationships, and that also lend themselves to the mechanics and motivations of crime novels. The culmination of Wendy's darker storytelling instincts came with 2016's All Is Not Forgotten, a national bestseller that was optioned for film by Warner Brothers, Emma in the Night and The Night Before followed, both to critical acclaim. This September, Wendy returns with the much-anticipated Don't Look for Me, the story of bereaved mother Molly Clark, who disappears while traveling through a desolate Connecticut town, and the daughter who refuses to allow local authorities to dismiss her mother's disappearance as an intentional walkaway. Publishers Weekly gave the title a starred review and called it an exemplary psychological thriller, noting distinctive, well-developed characters complement the skillfully paced plot. This moving look at the bond between a mother and her children reinforces Walker's place at the top of the genre. Despite suspicious people, creepy places, and all manner of devious plot twists, the author still calls these books Wendy Walker Light, which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? I'll let her tell you all about it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 26 of Central Booking. I'm very happy to be in the virtual company of Wendy Walker this morning, and Wendy is actually one of Connecticut's talents, so I always love when I can bring Connecticut talents into the show because we have so many. But welcome to the show, Wendy, and your new book is Don't Look for Me, which is coming out on Tuesday, September 15th, which is very, very soon, and even sooner when people actually see this video. So, hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. And yes, it's here. It's here. Pub date is on the 15th, and we are full steam ahead. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I know it's a whole new world with Zoom. It's funny because now people expect that you will be everywhere because you don't have to leave your home. So they're like, we can give you even more work to do. But anyway, I did want to ask you, so the new book, Don't Look for Me, it seems almost prescient because it opens with a dark and stormy night and a hurricane in Connecticut. And this season, we have seen a lot of that. So it really struck a chord, but I did just want to ask you very generally, can you talk about how that storm sort of sets the tone for the story to come?
Absolutely. So the story opens with Molly Clark, who's wife and mother. She's driving home and she disappears in this small town, and everyone assumes that she's walked away from her life. They look for her for a few days, and then they find a note that says, that she feels the family's better off without her, and it actually says, "Don't look for me." And then 2 weeks later, actually, her daughter Nicole gets a new lead, and it brings her back to this very eerie, desolate town, determined to find her mother at all cost. But what was so important about the storm was to really set the tone of the book, because it is atmospheric. It is about this small town. And it also helps to describe this sort of spinning emotions and the reasoning behind Molly's decision to get out of her car, which is what leads to her being abducted and disappearing. And so I needed that to be happening. I needed her to be in a situation where people would understand why she would accept a ride from a stranger, on a back road in a small town. And the storm just, enabled me to accomplish all of those things.
Sure, and then here we are in our current climate where it seems like every other week trees are falling down and crazy things are happening. But I was like, what kind of voodoo magic is this woman working? But no, nobody would wish that on anybody, but it's very timely. Obviously, it is hurricane season. But I wanted to ask you to expand on a couple of the things that you mentioned. So you did reference that, Molly Clark sort of does have reason where she might want to walk away from her life. And obviously that understanding also impacts affects the investigation and how it's conducted and what the authorities believe. So can you talk a little bit about her reasons for maybe wanting to leave her life, and then how that influences the authorities' perspective of her disappearance?
Absolutely. So the book was actually inspired by a moment that I had in my life. And I experienced this very quick thought at a time in my life when, I was under a lot of emotional stress, and then I'd had a really bad day on top of it. And I had a long drive home, and I was in a town like that. And I was at a gas station where Molly finds herself. And my emotions were spinning and my thoughts were spinning, and I was feeling like trapped. There was no way around them. I couldn't problem solve and figure out how to alleviate the situation I was in that was creating this emotional turmoil. And I had this flash thought when I saw this road that just was flanked by cornfields. It went on forever off into the horizon. And the thought was to just walk down the road. It was a vague thought. It was a flash of a thought. Of course, I didn't act on it. But as a writer, I always grab hold of like really bizarre moments like that and ask the question, where did this come from? What is it about the psychology that led to this thought? Has it happened to other people? And could I write a book about it? So it's fascinating. There's an actual term for it. It is emotional hijacking. And it describes a phenomenon where your emotions become so hot and so fired up that they overpower or hijack the rational part of the brain that normally makes decisions. So usually the rational part, which is much larger, will take input from the emotional part, but just like suggestions,
Right.
like the president and the chief of staff, like, all right, I'll take that under advisement. But sometimes there's a hijacking where the emotions are so big that they overpower the rational part of the brain, and people then act on thoughts like the one that I had, and they do walk away. They walk down that road. And I then discovered that most missing person cases are the result of a walk away situation. And those two pieces of research came together, and I knew I had to write a book about a woman where this happens. And it had to be there. It was just the perfect setting, the perfect setup. And it also, I was so connected to it emotionally myself that I knew I would be able to get really deep into the character of Molly Clark.
Right, sure. And I want to ask you too, because there's a very interesting dynamic between Molly and her daughter, Nicole. And Nicole ends up actually being the person who refuses to give up on her mother when everybody else says, look, she doesn't want to be found. She obviously walked away from her life and had good reason to do so. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of the relationship and why it is that Nicole ends up being the person who absolutely needs to find out what happened to her mom, regardless of whether or not it was intentional?
Yeah, so the family hasn't completely given up. The police have given up, and I mean it becomes sort of a cold case. The father has a reward out, and he's got a private investigator, and they're tracking her credit cards, and they're just assuming she's gonna at some point need money or come back, or they'll get some kind of lead, but they're not actively searching in this town anymore where she was last seen. Nicole is the one who acts on this new lead, even though everyone thinks it's just a quack looking for the reward money, because she and her mother are tied together by this tragic event in their family that happened 5 years before, when the youngest child died in a tragic accident. Both of them feel a sense of responsibility for how that accident occurred. And as a result, they have not been able to help each other the way family members often do to move through that grief and that guilt. So I actually, when I built the backstory for Molly, I knew I had to give her this really, really difficult backstory to explain why she would have this thought of walking away. I then realized that this book was also about the processing of guilt and grief and how we can actually get stuck in moving through those feelings. So Nicole and Molly are like the bow and stern of a sinking ship of guilt and grief, and they cannot help each other. They are just going down. And when this happens, when Molly disappears, she has to fight for her survival. And then when Nicole is given the opportunity to search for her and to go back to this town and actually take action and fight, she gets her fight on. So both of these women who have been just, drowning in guilt and grief over the loss of this family member, what's happening to them in this story sort of breaks the chains that have been holding them from moving through their guilt and grief, because they're finally able to fight something. They're finally able to do something to save one another. And that is the bond that they realize, we still have a family here. We still love each other. There's something worth fighting for, and we are going to fight for it to the bitter end at all cost. And that's sort of the emotional driver of the story.
Right, and I loved that because you really did an in-depth sort of exploration of how grief impacts everybody in the family, some more than others, but I mean, it impacts Molly differently than Nicole, different than Evan, different than the father. And I think that's really fascinating. And I wanted to ask you to speak quickly too, if you wouldn't mind, to Molly's relationship with her husband, John, and how that changed in the aftermath of their devastating loss. And also how then you're able to play on that idea that, of course, if the wife goes missing, the husband is going to be a suspect or a person of interest, because they're always the number one suspect or person of interest.
Of course, of course. So yeah, the relationship changed dramatically. And she was madly in love with her husband. They, it wasn't abnormally madly in love for being married as long as they were, but they loved each other. They respected each other, and they had met years before. She had a job. She was a middle school, science teacher. And, they had this really happy family, like just a normal, happy family. And she loved him very deeply. And the death of her child and the guilt she carried over the accident that took her child's life just really prevented her from feeling or expressing love or receiving love. Because that's one of the things that guilt does, is you feel unworthy. You feel undeserving of love. And so while she tries to give love and express love, she can't receive it. And love is a two-way street. So her love is really just caretaking. She cooks, she cleans, she drives, but she's really dead inside, and she can't respond to any kind of love. So the marriage has really fallen apart. And when she's on that road driving and her thoughts are spinning, it's the 5th anniversary of the death of her child. She's had a fight with Nicole, a really terrible fight. Her son was very dismissive when she went to visit him at his boarding school. And she has this thought about her husband pretending to be asleep when she came up to go to bed. And it's because there was a log in the fire that had just been put on. And she's just thinking that now. And so she's wondering, is he having an affair? Like, how much does he not love me? Or how much have I driven him away by not being able to express my love for him? And so that becomes, of course, it changed their relationship dramatically.
Sure. Okay, maybe a couple more questions specific to the book, and then if you don't mind, we'll sort of move into broader territory. And you touched on this a bit earlier, but I did want to ask you, you mentioned that obviously Molly's caught in this terrible storm. She runs out of gas, and then lo and behold, someone pulls up in a truck, and not only is there a man, but there's a young girl in the truck as well. So
Yes.
can you talk about sort of how Molly's emotional state, but also her instincts as a mother sort of drive her to maybe be more receptive to accepting that ride than she would have been otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I really had to, be kind of heavy-handed about, because we're all told not to get in cars with strangers. So I tried to think of what circumstances would make me, at my age, which is similar to Molly's, get into that truck. And so she's had this, she's having these thoughts. She's driving into a storm. She runs out of gas right before the gas station. She thought she could make it. She doesn't, but she can walk to the gas station. So she does. She runs to the gas station, but it's closed. Everything's boarded up because, as you know, in the middle of Connecticut, these storms can actually lead to tornadoes, like touch down and wipe things out. And the winds from the hurricanes can be devastating in central Connecticut. So the gas station's closed, it's boarded up. She sees the road. She has this thought of just walking into the storm and walking away, and the rain and the wind, it feels like it's just going to take her, and she wants to be taken away. She wants the pain to stop. But about a mile down the road, she sort of is like, wait, what am I doing? I can't do this to my family. This is an even more selfish act than staying and being, being sort of compromised by my emotions. So so she has this thought, and now she's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Now I have to get back to my car and back to my family and let them know I'm okay, because they'll worry, and that's a terrible thing to do to your family. So I put her in that state, and I thought, okay, I'm a mother. I feel like I've done something terrible that's going to worry my family. Here comes a truck. It's pulls up. There's a man inside, yes, but there's also a little girl, and she's precocious, and she's feisty, and she seems happy. It doesn't look like it's some, she's not like chained up or hidden under a blanket. She seems like the little girl was part of a family. And she rolls down the window and asks if Molly wants a ride. And there are gas tanks that are in the car, and there's water bottles in the front seat. And so she's thinking, well, yeah, this is a dad who went out with his daughter to get supplies for the storm, and he's headed back to town. And it all made sense. And I thought, in those circumstances, I probably would, because there's something about a child that makes you assume it's a family, and especially a child who seems happy and adjusted, and there was some banter that she has with the man in the truck, the little girl. So they have like this little banter, and it seemed like a very loving, healthy relationship. So there was nothing alarming about it at all. And by the way, trucks in this part of Connecticut, everybody has a pickup truck. I mean, that, in fact, when Nicole goes back on the lead about this truck, it turns out that everyone drives a black pickup truck, including the chief of police. So, it becomes this whole, all of those things taken together, hopefully allow readers to understand why she got the truck.
Sure, it was funny because she thinks she gets this hot tip, and like you said, it basically narrows it down to the entire community.
Yeah, everybody has a truck. Yeah.
And let me ask you too, what I love in a book is when there's an atmospheric setting that really becomes its own character. And you referenced, this little town of Hastings. And so it does have a very creepy, sort of desolate vibe. But also you sort of get a notion of the socioeconomic factors, of the people who are living in these towns that have sort of been left behind. So can you talk about that piece of it really quickly?
Absolutely. So there's a river that runs through Connecticut, and it's along a road, and it's really the only road that goes through central Connecticut. The highways are more on the coast. So if you want to go from here, like to upstate New York or to Massachusetts, there's one of two roads you can take depending on how far west you are. So Route 7, which is the road she's on, it sort of parallels the Housatonic River. And many, many years ago, most rivers in rural areas attracted companies for, number one, transporting materials and waste. There was a time when a river was just an easy way to get rid of waste. And so there's actually been some cleanup actions that have happened in this river. But some of these towns where these companies were based, when they left, there was nothing else. And so all of these families are there, all of these workers are there, and a whole community that was built around this industry have nothing left. And yet, where are they going to go? Like they have houses, they have, they're going to school. And so they just become economically depressed, and they get really hard hit by any kind of economic downturn that happens on a broader scale. The other thing about it, though, is that because people have been there for generations, and they are small, and there's a reason that they're still small. And that is because there's no train coming through. There's no, so people aren't, commuting from other cities to live there. Whoever was there, those families are the same families that have been there for generation after generation. So they all know each other, or they know each other's history. And that creates both a physical atmosphere, but also a sort of psychological atmosphere, and that everyone has some sort of history with everyone else, even if it's not direct, even if it's a family member with someone else's family member, but they all know things about one another and about the family's histories. And that is what Nicole encounters when she goes, is that she's discovering all of these connections, and sometimes they're not being, completely candid and giving full disclosure. Sometimes they're lying. And so it just creates this fertile ground for a really atmospheric story.
Sure. Great. So moving into plotter pantser territory, because everybody always wants to know. I mean, your books are very intricate. It's a fine balancing act, and I find, it has to be sort of to pull some of these things off in suspense. But can you talk about how much of your story you know before you start writing versus what develops organically as you're going throughout the process?
Yeah, I have to plot out the structure. For me, a book is like a Jenga tower, like all the bricks are there. They all have to be there. And I have to know where they go in order to build the rest of the structure. So I have to lay out the disclosure. So I'll usually have a chapter by chapter outline that will have just the bullet points of what has to be disclosed in that chapter. Nicole finds this out about this person, and then she meets this person who gives her a one-liner that's going to be the cliffhanger for the chapter. The rest of the chapter is then the creative part of talking, Nicole's feelings and, describing all of the things that are happening. But I know that I have to accomplish those things in that chapter. And the same thing for Molly. When you have a dual narration and also a split time frame, that also becomes complicated, because I have to think, okay, what's happening to Molly is 2 weeks earlier than what Nicole is experiencing. And so I have to make sure I keep track of that, because I don't want you to go into Molly's chapters knowing things that I don't want you to know yet, because I want Molly to discover them, and I want them to be shockers in Molly's chapters. All the shockers can't happen in Nicole's chapters. So there is a lot of plotting for that type of disclosure. And then the rest of it is sort of organic. And by the way, as I'm writing, things will change, because I'll just be writing and the conversation between characters will lead somewhere, and I'll think, oh my gosh, new plot twist, new character development. And then I'll go through and I'll rework everything to accommodate that new twist. So it absolutely changes, but every change gets threaded through to make sure that the Jenga tower doesn't fall down.
Sure. So sort of to piggyback on that a little bit, for people who don't know, you wrote some women's fictions titles some years back, and I actually remember the first and only time I met you in person, you had a book out. There was a golden dress on the cover. I cannot remember the name of the book.
Social Lives. Yeah, it was called Social Lives. Yep.
Yeah, and that had to be, I don't know, 12, 14 years ago. It was a while back. But can you talk about why you made the transition from sort of contemporary fiction to suspense, and also the idea of suspense in stories? Because regardless of the genre you're writing in, there does need to be some kind of suspense or impetus. But then when you're writing mysteries or thrillers, there are some unique, aspects to the type of suspense that you write. So can you say what lends itself from that background to writing mystery or thriller? And then what were the new thoughts that you had to adjust to as you moved into crime novels?
So actually the first novel I ever wrote was a Grisham-esque legal thriller, because I'm a lawyer by training, and that's what I loved to read. This was, back in the early 2000s. And I am not a trained writer. So when I decided I wanted to write, it was a desire to tell stories and to give life to characters that I often came across in my head. And so I had to sort of learn how to write, and I had, help from a writing professor, and sort of over time have built my toolbox of writing skills, which I am still building. I I feel like I'm always catching up to the more literary writers and constantly learning new techniques to tell my stories. But I think what I always come into the project with is the desire to tell a good story. So the legal thriller never sold. It's now completely outdated, but I got an agent. And then the next story that I had in my head was about suburban culture. So that was actually called Four Wives. And I really wanted to cover different topics that I was discovering as a suburban stay-home mom at the time. And that book was really structured around telling that story, and Social Lives as well. Those two books did get published, but they didn't really sell. Thank you to all my friends and family who purchased a copy. But I think that was about it. So I went back to practicing law, and I got a job in family law where I started to learn psychology. I had been in corporate law before, corporate litigation, and now I was in family law. So I was not only encountering so many characters with a lot of psychological complexities, but also getting training in these areas of sociopathic illnesses. And so but I kept writing. I didn't give up on it. I wrote another women's fiction book that was a little bit darker, and I found a new agent. My first agent had passed away, and she was, wasn't quite sure what to do with my very dark women's fiction or contemporary fiction piece. And she said, why don't you just write a dark psychological thriller? Gone Girl, by the way, had opened up this huge hunger for these types of dark stories that lived in characters' minds more than in the external action. So I studied the genre, and I knew what I wanted to write about. And it was like, when I started writing, it was like coming home. It's where I need to be. The stories I like to tell, the characters I like to write about, they are in this genre. So it was really a process to get there. And I wish I had started there, but it's been joyful, and I love it. And the transition was absolutely seamless.
Sure. And I have to ask you too. So you yourself are a mother, and I'm always interested, in people who write stories that have a high level of emotional resonance, which yours do. Can you talk about, being a parent and sort of the vulnerabilities and the insecurities that come along with that, and how you're able to draw on those to create sort of the emotional world that lives within your books?
Oh my gosh. I mean, being a mother, I have 3 sons, it's like the biggest emotional roller coaster that's ever been built. It's it's joy, it's terror, it's fear, worry, it's everything, and it's all the time. And so I draw from that constantly. I think all of my books have elements of parent-child relationships at some point in them. And also being a family law attorney and sort of studying as a professional the dynamics of families, why they fall apart, how to help them move forward, and just understanding all the pieces of a family. And there's just so much emotion there. When we think about life as human beings, we don't think about our work mostly. We think about our relationships. We think about love. We think about our children. We think about our friendships. And, if you look at, the book topics and song lyrics and every medium, television, movies, so much of them are about family relationships.
It's true. There's not really the song, organize my email folders today. It hasn't happened yet, I don't think. Maybe we should write that. All right, I will let you go shortly. Just a couple of questions to wrap up, if you don't mind. But another thing that I think always interests me, and some other people tend to find it fascinating as well. But can you talk a little bit about your reading life and how that's influenced your creative pursuits?
My reading, like what I read, books
Yeah,
that I
like
read. Yeah.
yeah, what you read and how that's sort of throughout your life interested the kinds of stories that you wanted to tell and maybe that you find yourself writing now. I don't know if you were the child that was reading.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was a voracious reader when I was younger. And I think I always loved mystery type stories, and but also character driven stories. And as I got older, I loved legal thrillers, but also really, not necessarily romance novels, but sort of Nicholas Sparks type, books, like love stories that made you cry a little. Anything that makes me feel. So I tend towards books that provoke some sort of emotion, and they're usually pretty dark, or they'll have some sadness, or just something that is complex and interesting. And I always look for that in the first few chapters. Where's the edge? Where's the edge? I'm much less interested in reading about, sort of more flat characters going through a lot of action than I am really complicated characters going through less action. I would take, that would be the trade-off for me. So when I read a lot in my genre, because I like to help authors, like to blurb. I blurb my friends. I blurb up and coming authors. I try to blurb at anything that I can if I have time. And so I read a lot in the genre, and some books I appreciate because of the plot, and it's, it's well written. Some books, the writing is so incredible that they're just so literary and so well done. And I have like writer's envy. But the books that really hit home are usually the ones that combine something really emotionally poignant with also a really good plot. And also brevity in the descriptions. It's how I write. It's how I like to read. Just, I can get a character in a couple of sentences. You can just, I always use this example, but does she order a scotch or a Chardonnay? Woman walks into bar, orders a scotch, orders a Chardonnay. Already, I now know what the writer is trying to convey to me about this character. And I drink both. It depends on the day. But if the writer is specifically telling me that she's ordered a scotch, I have a completely different picture in my mind than if she ordered a Chardonnay.
Right.
And if a writer uses those techniques with that intention, you can get across a personality with really just 3 words.
Right. Sure. All right.
Yeah.
Last 2 questions for you. I'm going to make you my guinea pig if you don't mind.
Sure.
So,
I think.
I know, right? You heard it. She said sure, and then you thought about it. But so crafty question. I mean, everybody always wants to know what is your best advice for writers. So I'm going to start asking people, what is the best advice that you ever got? And then on the flip side, what is the best advice that you never got and had to learn yourself and wish that maybe someone was able to clue you in on?
Okay, so this is going to sound really cynical, but the best advice that I ever got had to do with just the entertainment industry overall. And that was get money up front and cash your check. And I was like, oh, because, it gets really complicated if, a lot of authors will, we talk about, well, should I take a lower royalty, a lower advance and maybe a bigger royalty, or if it's a TV deal, like, oh, I'll take it on the back, money, I'll take more money on the back end with the profits, which there never are any. That's like the joke in Hollywood. There's never any profits because everything is always always an expense or whatever, I don't know. But that was the best like practical advice in terms of the business.
Sure.
There's so much good writing advice, and it's so I can't even think of one that influenced me more than anything else, because so much of it is personal.
Sure.
Some people say just, oh, sit down and write for 20 minutes and whatever's there is there. That doesn't help me. The advice that I wish I had gotten, oh boy. I guess I would say this: don't freak out when you've spent a ton of time writing something and you have to put it away, scrap it, delete it, put it, before, put it in your drawer, now put it in your, put it on a hard drive somewhere and forget about it. Because it's going to happen. And I would say that all of the books I wrote that haven't been published and will never be published, they taught me something about structure or character, and it's, about something that didn't work. Sometimes it's important to learn what doesn't work, as much as it is to see what does work. And for me, I also learned what my Achilles heel is, which is I'm always trying to write darker than what my audience wants. So when you read something dark, just know that I've toned it down for you. This is toned down, okay? This is like Wendy Walker light. Wendy Walker dark never sees the light of day. It always gets revised lighter. So that's one. And the other is that I enjoy a flatter style of writing, that, where you're almost seeing the character post-trauma, and you can sort of feel the pain that's there, but it's muted by, sort of, just an affectation that happens with people who have suffered trauma. And it's like a wound that's sort of healed, but not really. But what you're seeing is the scar and not what caused it. So I like to read that, and I like to write that, but it doesn't resonate with readers because they really want to be pulled in, I think, with a thriller, right away to the action, right away to the characters and their emotions. And so I always have to stop myself when I'm writing in a more detached voice. And I've had to scrap books because of that. So I wish someone had just said to me, just chill out. You'll learn something from every book that you have to scrap. But it's painful because of the time and mental energy that goes into writing a book. Even 100 pages of a book, it's very hard to put it away.
Sure. All right, that leads me to my final question, and you can probably see it coming. But you talked about how the books you wrote then have led you to the books that you write now. So I'm going to ask you, after you've poured your blood, sweat, and tears into Don't Look for Me, and you're like, I spent a year on that book, and now we're all going to ask you, can you tease what we might expect next from you?
So I actually have a really fun might not be right. It was fun for me to write. It's a dark original Audible. So it's only available through Audible. It's only an audiobook, and it's a short. So they have been doing a lot of these. They're 2 hours to listen to, 20,000 words. So it's about a quarter of the length of a full novel. But they are full-on thrillers. So this, I wrote that this past year during the pandemic. And I was able to reprise a character from All Is Not Forgotten. It's not a sequel, it's an independent story, but it brings this character back, and we catch up with him 3 years after All Is Not Forgotten happened. And so if you read All Is Not Forgotten or listened to it on audio, we have the same narrator, Dylan Baker. He's incredible. He's narrating the new one, which is called Hold Your Breath. And it is sort of classic Wendy Walker. It brings in my very first character, who I just adore writing, and sometimes think I might be him in another life, and also this other plot idea that I've also been thinking about, and was wondering if I should write it into a novel, but I put them together, and then I wrote a book during the beginning of COVID, really quickly. It was just, for me, I wrote it. It was really a character-driven thriller, and that character shows up in Hold Your Breath. And my next full novel, I don't know what it's going to be. I'm going to start it after I'm done promoting. But that piece that I wrote during COVID and that character, I'm going to take a really hard look at to see if it's something that needs to be scrapped or something that actually will be something that will be good to follow. Don't look for me.
Excellent. Well, that was a good tease.
Yeah.
Taking it all back to beginnings. All right. Thank you so much, Wendy Walker. I appreciate your time. I guess we should probably hold up our book covers one more time, remind
I
people.
always hold mine up upside down, but here
I
it
know,
is.
right? And it's such a cool cover. Like the rain effect is really awesome, and it looks different in different
Yeah.
lights, which is just
Yeah, and like it's such a great cover. It was a first take cover, which doesn't always happen, but that's Molly, and this is the road and the truck coming up behind her and the storm. I mean, this is the first chapter of the book on the cover. It was brilliant. So I love
that's
love
pretty awesome. So don't look for me out Tuesday, September 15th, which is really, really soon. Thank you so much, Wendy. It was a real pleasure catching up with you.
Thank you. And if you want to learn more, you can go to my website, wendywalkerbooks.com, or my Instagram homepage has all my links and everything. So it's all right there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Stay safe and healthy.
You too. That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.